Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for those who are joining online. This is another chance for you to hear a little bit more about some of our workforce and community housing initiatives. This project has been started maybe 15 months ago, kind of just taking another look at kind of city-owned property to evaluate, is there potential for development for community housing. And I just want to thank a number of partners that we work with, the Sun Valley Company, the YMCA, and others, to kind of just explore different opportunities, different options. And I will turn it over to our city administrator, but it's really a chance just to kind of get the community sort of take on some of the directions we're recommending in terms of which parcels of land we would pursue next. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Jade Riley, who is the city administrator, go through a short presentation, and then we will open it up for questions. We have here our Director of Planning and Building, Morgan Landers. We have Director of Housing, Carissa Connolly, and they will also be here to answer some questions. This is being recorded, and there are people following online as well, and this can also be shown later on. You'll see at the end, there'll be a little survey that we'd ask you to take at some point. You don't have to take it immediately, just to get your feedback. So with that, turn it over to Jade Riley, give us a presentation, and we'll go from there. And thanks again for coming in.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you all, everybody from the community, for showing up and taking time out of your schedules to visit with us. So I'll just be doing a brief presentation, and then we'll go into a Q&A session. So a little bit of background of why did we do this analysis. As the mayor mentioned, we wanted to look at all our key city properties to understand their potential for future community housing development. So we used a third-party architectural firm for us to really look at each of these sites. And one thing I really want to emphasize is we've assumed no changes in the city's comprehensive plan or zoning code in this analysis. So this is applying the current Ketchum City Comprehensive Plan and the current zoning code. And we felt that was appropriate until the community finalized where we were going with the new comp plan and the zoning code. So just want to reiterate that. The second goal of the analysis was really just to give better visibility and transparency to the community of where does the town hope to go the next several years of future housing development, so that you as community members are not feeling surprised when a project gets closer to turning dirt or starting construction, that you feel like, yeah, I went to that meeting, I knew that was on the horizon. So then specifically today, again, I'll do a quick presentation. We'll open it up to group, both online and in person Q&A. And then the bulk of the time, staff would like to just visit with you on each of these boards that goes into deeper information. So a lot of the slides I'll cover are duplicates that you're going to see of the boards, but I'm just trying to give you a little context as a group so we can have some Q&A before everybody breaks up into that. And then, as the mayor said, we do have a survey with a little QR code that you can take on your phone, or if you hate technology, you can just write it on the piece of paper today and give us back. The important part is we want to share that survey with the city council when we do an update on this project. So your feedback is very important. Process-wise, we've spent the last year and some doing with some other projects. This one's fit in there, doing the analysis part. We're now ready to start moving through the following steps that I'll cover. So obviously we're getting community feedback. We then plan to, in February, go back to the city council, report these findings from the public, and really go a little deeper in this. We're marching towards, at least at a staff level, we are recommending to the city council, there are 2 of these properties we are recommending move forward. And specifically, those would move forward to issue out to the affordable housing development community requests for proposals. That's an important part, and we're happy to visit a little bit more about that, but that really just goes out to those interested, putting projects together, comes back, and then really from there, the staff would look at those RFPs in the month of April, and then in May or June timeline, we would be coming back to the city council. If those requests for proposals looked successful to the criteria we've set forth, we would then be recommending a proposed project on each of these sites. There might not be an acceptable proposal that comes in, and we would have to reissue another call. So it's definitely not a guarantee that we will get responses for affordable housing projects from the development community. But you can see we are at least moving forward to a summer timeline. If one of these sites needs federal tax credit funds, those funds the applications for those are due the first week in August to the Idaho Housing and Finance Association. So in essence, that's the date we're working back from if we're seeking outside federal funding for these projects. And again, I'll cover this at the end of the presentation and happy to answer any questions on the process. Let's start with just a little bit of context setting. A lot of familiar faces in the room, so many of these graphs should look familiar. These come from our Housing Action Plan. That's online on Project Ketchum, the full Housing Action Plan. So just kind of the first data point is just really to remind the community when we think about total housing stock in Ketchum and we look at the last 40 years, the way our housing stock breaks down has really changed. So if we go back in the 1970s, our housing stock was almost equally split on the left hand of that pie chart, a third between long-term rentals, short-term rental, and owner-occupied units. If you go to the far right pie chart, you can see we've significantly decreased the supply in town of long-term rentals, and we've seen a significant increase in short-term rentals. And kind of a factoid is in the last 10 years, and I apologize, my mother would not be happy, I have horrible penmanship. We lost about 300 long-term rental units in just the last decade related to that. So we've seen a significant change in our available housing stock for people who've usually worked and lived in Ketchum. I think the media has done a good job reporting that we are significantly constrained as Idaho cities to regulate short-term rental. There's a pending bill that could just almost eliminate any city regulation of short-term rental units. So the city has very limited powers in how we regulate short-term rentals because the legislature has usurped that authority for Idaho cities. The next piece I just want to highlight, the bottom graph here just shows how Ketchum, as part of its total housing inventory, what percent of that total housing is deed restricted community housing units. And you can see we do rank last in the number of deed restricted units in relation to other communities. And again, these are not wrong or right. We're just trying to give some data points to set the context. And on the right side of this screen, as part of the Housing Action Plan, we did feel it was important to set a goal for the next decade of how many units is Ketchum trying to reestablish. It's an aggressive goal of ranging between 600 to 900 units over this next decade. Again, I've had people push back on that, and we at least come back to, at a starting point, can we agree, let's at least reestablish those 300 units we lost in the last decade of long-term rental. So again, those are just kind of our numbers. So let's also just kind of paint context of when we say we're working on housing for those in the community, I'd like to just give some examples. Here tonight, we're talking about larger new construction projects, and that's an important part, but that is not the only avenue to create housing units. So when the Housing Action Plan was put together, we had some immediate kind of first year pieces we put in place. These were not viewed as permanent, all of these necessarily as permanent solutions. The first one's a good example. We launched a program called Lease to Locals. It was targeted at the short-term owners, short-term rental owners, to see if we could provide a financial incentive to push them back with their units into the long-term rental pool. And we've been successful at getting some units on that front. So that was an early intervention. There were several people in the community, Sarah Michael, who was a former Blaine County Housing Authority, and Keith, which we worked with, in which Lift Tower Lodge was owned at the time by Blaine County Housing. This is not a criticism, but it wasn't being fully utilized because it didn't have up-to-date sewer and water. So we worked to have that asset transferred to the city of Ketchum, and we made those improvements. So we've had for the last year and a half, 2 years, had Lift Tower Lodge fully leased out in those 14 units. We just really wanted to make use of an important public asset. And then last, the Blaine County Housing Authority, through a partnership with the city of Ketchum, did a master lease with Silver Creek, which was a care facility in Haley that had went out of business. And it was set up to work as multifamily. And so the city and Blaine County Housing Authority put that under a master lease so that those rooms could be rented out. Again, each of the Lift Tower Lodge and Silver Creek, we would classify as almost kind of emergency shelter facilities. We wouldn't really say that they're long-term living establishments, but it's an important part to just put heads and beds in a safe place. So that was kind of some immediate examples with the Housing Action Plan. Permanent actions, again, just trying to demonstrate we're not just doing big housing projects. Our council has been very aggressive on a deed restriction program. We refer to it, because it's government, we have to have acronyms, OPP, which is a fancy way of saying Ownership and Preservation Program. This program is really about trying to look at either buyers or sellers in our community who have an existing unit and say, let's say Neil wanted to sell his unit, put it on the market. We would be able to go to him as a seller. We would arrange, based on the value of his property, compensate for a deed restriction for that piece. That would then be permanent for that property going forward, to where Neil could only sell to another local. It would keep that housing unit in the local pool and not go into short-term rental or out-of-state or out-of-town use. So that's the deed restriction program, sometimes referred to as OPP. The council recently allocated $1 million for that. We have one of our council members here tonight, Tripp. So that's a program we're really trying to amp up and market to realtors, banking, title company, to really get that word out that if you're a buyer or a seller of a unit in Ketchum today, you can work with the city, work with the housing authority, and we can purchase a deed restriction and help people kind of preserve. Really, it's about preserving existing units for local workers. A second example of that on more of a moderate scale, the council had a special meeting today at noon. They approved the acquisition of a property that's right on the corner of Sun Valley Road and Second, right on the corner there. It's a current building that has 3 condo units in it, and then it has bare dirt right behind it. And so with that acquisition, what we're going to be able to do is resell those 3 units out to community members at a market rate with that deed restriction program. And again, you would buy it and could only sell it to another Ketchum local. And then eventually we would look at building a building on the back of that property for about 5 more units. So again, we're doing different sizes of solutions. So then we get to our next one, which is construction of new units. So not just trying to utilize better what we have in our community, but how do we construct new? This is very typical for cities, predominantly in the West, who don't have all the traditional tools for affordable housing. And specifically resort cities, they really look at how do they leverage the property they own. And the notion is this: the town should be here 100 years from now, and 200 years, and 400 years. And so we are really, as a community, our council has made a commitment not to sell city property, but to lease it long-term so that it's always in kind of the town's ownership, and it's part of that portfolio. The other thing that does is when we lease our property to development opportunities, it gets us actually some of the highest point categories by the Idaho Housing and Finance, who passes on state funding. because in essence, it's used as a city asset as a match to those federal funds. So again, it kind of does two things, keeps in the town's ownership and control, and two, helps us access other funds. Examples of that, the Bluebird project, is wrapped up. It is fully leased out. We're happy. I'm always happy to visit with people. We have kind of anonymized data there that shows who everybody's working for. I've had a lot of questions of that. We're happy to share that as far as what companies those tenants are working at. The project is actually underparked than what was kind of worried or feared. And we knew that was a really important point to report back to the community of how many cars are we seeing in relation to tenants. So we're proud of that project. Many of you are aware of the First in Washington project. That obviously is not a done or final project. The direction from the Urban Renewal Agency Board is they're committed to that project if we can figure out with the community public parking. And if public parking cannot be figured out, they do not want to move the First in Washington project forward. So you should notice on their social media feed and in your mailbox on Friday, a little postcard because you love city government. We have an opportunity next week of similar sessions to talk about the funding proposal for that garage as part of the First in Washington project. Love for you to attend or come online. We need feedback of whether people support the funding approach for the public garage. We then plan the following week on the 24th to have a joint meeting likely between our city council and the Urban Renewal Agency and report back whether the community supports the funding for the garage concept and what that means to that housing project at First in Washington. So happy to visit with you a little bit more about that. Beyond publicly owned properties, I get a lot of questions from people of, good Lord, are you guys talking to partners on other land in Ketchum? And my answer is yes, almost every week and every day. So I've had several meetings with the Simplot family who owns the property right across the street. We've made some kind of initial, just at staff level, offers as far as interest. And to date, there hasn't been an interest of moving forward of a housing project on the Simplot property. But we're dialoguing and just trying to explore any partnerships. Equally, several meetings with Albertsons, who owns the old stock lumberyard site down in the light industrial. They are interested in a mixed-use project of housing, but wait for it. They would like to see a grocery store go with that project. And so under the current zoning of both our comprehensive plan and our zoning code, that is not allowed at that property corner right now. So really that is going to have to wait for the community to weigh in on the comp plan and the zoning code for that discussion to move forward. But they are open to a mixed use project of some housing on the old stock lumber yard. I think the point is, I just want to get across, one, we take very seriously trying to dialogue with these private partners and figure out if there is a partnership for housing. One, two, it always takes time when it's other people's property. So as the public entity, if you're going to hold us accountable for producing housing, we've tried to focus on property we can control first, but still work with private partners to get additional properties. So kind of transitioning from that context setting, as we talk about building more units or acquiring more units in town, I think there's a very fair question of who are you building units for and what income levels? Very fair question. One of the board, we have several boards over here and Carissa's team will be staffing these, but our housing action plan is broken down by different stratas of area median income. It's based on the latest data of Blaine County's economy. So we're looking at where are people working, what are they earning, and then what is their gap need. And the point of this chart is we would like to have housing opportunities for all income areas or stratas. That said, the city has focused really on the areas that are gaps. So if we have partners like Arch and Wood River Housing Trust and others, there's others, in the valley that might be working on projects up here at the upper incomes. We love that, we appreciate that, and we respect that. And we're going to try to focus city resources then on areas that people aren't able to focus on. So again, we're trying to move the needle on several of these income levels for workers. And really, because we have limited public funds, target those funds to where other people are not participating currently. So again, we're happy to visit of which income levels we're trying to get housing units for. So let's get into the evaluation of the specific city-owned properties. So again, just reiterating, we used the current zoning. We weren't cute and said we're going to rezone something because we're the city, that type of stuff. So the analysis really looks at what's current zoning. So things like height, setback, all of that, we just assumed what's currently allowed under the zoning law. But really, we wanted to look at these properties to understand which ones were potential. And so you can see we looked at 5 different properties. We're recommended at a staff level to move forward with 2 onto a request for proposal. That is the South YMCA parking lot and the Lift Tower Lodge property. We are not recommending on the 3 lower properties, and I'll go through those here in just a second. So let's look at the properties that were evaluated but not recommended. And I think for a couple of these, I would say not recommended at this time because of challenges or other issues. So let's start on some properties in and around the YMCA. John Dontero is here, and I just really want to thank John as being a board member of the YMCA. He attended a lot of our meetings, and they asked a lot of great questions and gave us great feedback when we were meeting with their board. But our first goal was really making sure whatever and I think most people, everybody knows in this room, all the YMCA and the surrounding property sits on city property. We have a great lease with the YMCA, a long-term lease, and the lease spells out the duration of that, and it talks about parking here in a second that I'll cover. So one, we really want to make sure whatever we propose, it works well with the YMCA's expansion plans. Related to that, we have a current commitment of making sure around the YMCA today, there's 150 parking spots. That's what's today. What we've committed to the YMCA as at the point that they kind of pull their building permit and look at an expansion, the city would then bring on an additional 50 parking spots within the vicinity to make sure there's 200 around the YMCA. So these analysis that I'll be going through assume those intentions. And then any housing proposed around the YMCA, making sure there's at least 1 parking spot for 1 housing unit. So we're making sure that it is adequately parked. Making sure, again, there's flexibility for things that come up. And then last but not least, we love the bike path and that amenity that goes in front of the YMCA. So making sure that we preserve the bike path and its functional use. So those were kind of the goals that went into the analysis for the YMCA kind of city properties. We did, I'm just kind of working around the property. We did have a discussion with the Y about would anything make sense in what we would call the north parking area. And both of us really agreed, no. That's within the expansion area. Parking is a really important part of the YMCA program, and they're going through right now their expansion plans, and not everything is fully dialed in. And so really it made sense, give the YMCA some flexibility to figure things out on the north side of the property. So then over on Lewis Street, again, next to the recycling center, just to orientate you, the recycling center sits right here, and then fire training's over here. This is a really good example of existing zoning and kind of a difference a small little line makes. All of you guys are familiar with that wall that goes down the light industrial area. That wall is 2 different zonings. So on this side, on the YMCA side, that's tourist zoning, and it's a much more kind of intense, flexible zoning. Everything on the Lewis Street side of that wall is light industrial. So when we look at that and we apply the criteria of the light industrial, we were really only able to get about 10 to 12 housing units on there because we have to provide ground floor light industrial space and really just comply like anyone else would building into the light industrial. Would this grossly change if a year from now the zoning code changes and some things change in the light industrial? Yes. But again, we were trying to honor the existing zoning. And then obviously we would need to relocate the fire training tower. That's not a deal killer. Honestly, the department worked hard on some different options before it landed at that spot. So we're conversing with some other partners, places like Ohio Gulch. Would that make sense to have the training tower as more of a midpoint? So it is not a brain buster to think about the training tower to move if it needed to be. But again, at this point, we would not be recommending moving forward with Lewis Street. Coming out of the YMCA, going over to 6th and Leadville. So again, we're next to Memory Park, Silver Creek, and the 511 building. This obviously works as a public parking lot right now. We did do kind of analysis. You can get 23 to upwards of 30 units in that site. Not surprisingly, our concern is because of the parking utilization of that lot right now, that's one of our most busy couple streets of public parking. And due to some other kind of zoning pieces, the feeling on this one is this might be a more mid to long-term opportunity, but it did not make sense at this point to move forward with 6th and Leadville. Again, just kind of some of these complexities of that site. So let's transition to recommended properties and go into depth there. So the first one, again, back to our YMCA goals. I won't go through all of these, but these were definitely applicable as we looked at the south lot. Let me just cover parking real quick because I know that's a hot button issue. So as I show you kind of what's proposed with this YMCA South lot, you're probably asking yourself, well, how are you going to comply with the parking agreement? So in essence, the parking that sits now in the South Y would come over here, and when we moved the recycling from all those dumpsters down to the more efficient piece, that was with the thought process that we could knock down this center wall between the YMCA and the recycling, add additional parking in there. So in essence, the South Y parking would move from the South Y over to that Lewis Street location, and that's where the public parking would go. One of the other reasons that made sense to us and the YMCA is most people regard kind of this side entrance to the Y as kind of the front door, even though we would say the legal front door is facing Warm Springs, but most people come in that side thing. That actually public parking over here is a lot closer to that door for customers than this current park and ride facility is. So again, we have a detailed board of kind of how the parking lays out. I want to be transparent. Those moves just keep us at the 150 spots. When we think about the Y expanding and getting it up to 200 spots, the city then would need to look at on-street parking on Warm Springs and Saddle. I know some people are like, oh, I don't like that. I get a lot of calls about speeding on Warm Springs. We could almost have a police officer all day be at that spot. And the reality is Warm Springs is over-engineered as a roadway. It's engineered for about 30 to 35 mile an hour speed. And so if you really want to bring it down to its legal speed of 20, things like adding parking or other calming measures on the road is one of our best practices for trying to bring down speed. Right now, it's unfettered. And so you feel like, let's gun it and get out to Warm Springs piece. So that's, again, kind of the long-term parking plan. So let's go into the South Y and a little bit more details there. Again, there's a board that just kind of shows you how we're complying with the elements of the zoning code, things like open space, setbacks, the height. So again, we're assuming lower height than the YMCA building today. The YMCA building actually had what's called a PUD approval. So it actually has a little higher height approval than the normal zoning piece. So we would have a little lower roof line in these proposals. So the architectural team came up with a couple different options for each of these sites, and we'd love your feedback tonight when we kind of break up and get to the boards or do the survey. So the two options are pretty similar, but architecturally they're a little different, and that obviously is important to you as members of the community. So both of them, the most kind of intense option gets us about 28 units on the South Y, and then the second one gets us around 24 units. And you can see in the building design, this one is a little more of a kind of a unified building footprint. I'd heard some people walk in, it's very fair. These are massing block pictures on there. Do not regard them as the architectural look of the building. That would be much later when we figure out. But we did want to show you just kind of the building footprint and its intensity. So again, when you look at the drawings, just understand it's not really been customized of its true architectural piece. But the project on the left on the screen is really kind of a unified building. So it's got a central corridor. You would park under the building. The parking would be tucked under each of the buildings, and it would be a more unified building approach. The one on the right was trying to take a little bit from its roof line and design, a little bit of a nod towards Parkside condos across the street. So it's got a little more of a smaller scale to it, and thus the less of the unit count. Again, just trying to mimic more of a different roof line that you would see over on Parkside. So again, we're happy to visit with you when we break out on the details of those. So we'll transition from the South Y to Lift Tower Lodge. Let's go through a little bit of background before we jump into the options here. Again, this property was originally from a longstanding couple in the community, actually gave it over to the county. Then the county transferred to Blaine County Housing. Blaine County Housing transferred it to the city. So what we're assuming in these options is this right now is the property line that the city has. When River Run was annexed umpteen years ago and zoned for a future redevelopment, it was around, I think, 2008 or 10 that was done. The city, when that was brought in, annexed and re-entitled for kind of a future village, the city very typically asked for different public amenities as part of that. So what happened was there was 3 properties that Sun Valley Company owned that eventually were to be transferred to the city as part of that annexation approval. One was a portion, and the property actually laid out this way, was supposed to be transferred to the city for a housing project. So really what we've done is talked to Sun Valley Company and said, what if we realign so the property sits more parallel and consistent to the existing Lift Tower Lodge? And I do really want to do a kudos to Sun Valley Company. The way the agreement reads today is upon application for a building permit for River Run, the property will be transferred. As we all know, there is no plan by the family to develop River Run. So when we went and met with them, said, would you guys be interested in transferring the property earlier to the city, just to be nice? They said, we'll talk to the family, kind of came back and said, we're open to that. We understand the need. So we have a conceptual agreement with them to move forward with this request for proposal. And then if things look good from the city council's perspective and the communities, that property would be transferred. So we would have a larger development parcel there at Lift Tower. A couple important goals over on this property. I just want to highlight, obviously one of the major pieces is preserving the Bald Mountain View corridor of the mountain. So these proposals that you'll see on the boards, we've tried to step back any development clear of the Serenade intersection to not really block the view of the mountain. Obviously, it is the entrance to town, so making sure we set that good tone. I like to remind people this spring you will see Idaho Power undergrounding all the power lines going from Jim Street all the way to the Big Wood Bridge. So all of that will be cleaned up. Those power lines will be undergrounded. The city was unsuccessful, but we wanted desperately to get a roundabout at Serenade and that intersection. We were unsuccessful. Idaho Department of Transportation plans to put a new lighted intersection there. The city, Sun Valley Company, Idaho Parks and Foundation, who manages the Reimheimer Ranch, all oppose that. And we have a great partnership with ITD, but their state director's office just disagreed with us. We're trying one more kind of Hail Mary to see if we can, they just bid the project for south of town. It's over budget. We would like to swoop in and say, let's just remove that intersection from your bid package and save yourself some money and get back on budget. We'll see. But we think the roundabout and all of that would have just really made a nice entrance to town. So just wanted to let you know that. So as we look at these two options, there is kind of a stylistic and cost difference in these options. As you look at them, I just want you to be aware of that. So first, between these two options, we're ranging from 44 units upwards of 50 units between the two. So they're somewhat close. The piece that is not close, and I just want to be transparent, that is the parking between those two units. And the reason is the project on the left side is an all wood construction surface parking, right? So you're parking back here, kind of tucked behind the buildings. And so it is tougher because we're all familiar with the topography of Lift Tower and it's sloped down. When you do surface parking like that, it's tough to get a high yield count. Could we alter some things maybe on Second Avenue and do some on-street parking? Maybe. On the right side option, that is a combination of what's called a concrete podium, which is just an engineer's fancy way of saying, let's use our topography to our advantage. Everybody knows where Dr. Tony's office and all of that is. Most of those buildings on Second Avenue, they have basically used that topography. They've done their parking into the hillside, capped it with a concrete podium, and then constructed on top. So that's really what we're saying on that option two would be similar. You would excavate down into the hillside, put a concrete podium. It'd be basically a concrete box. You'd come in, that would be your parking, and then your buildings would sit on top of that concrete box. So again, similar unit counts, but different on the parking impact. Happy to answer any questions on that. So we do have a sheet that kind of summarizes pros and cons between the site. You know, there are trade-offs, and we want to be very transparent that no site is an easy or, perfect deal. So on the South Y, the pros, it's proximity to the school, the YMCA. We have a lot of public amenities in that area. So it is very much in and around an existing neighborhood. And we see that as kind of a positive piece. I don't know if I'd call it cons, but it is a trade-off, is that we will need to spend money to put in new parking up at the Lewis Street and get that prepped for the new housing, and then fund the new on-street parking on Warm Springs Road. Over on Lift Tower, again, it's close to town or in town piece. It's adjacent to other residential development. So again, we like creating neighbors or neighborhoods. I have some people who kind of propose, let's do a housing project way out where, and that, I understand why people say that, but at the end of the day, we want people to live with neighbors and be part of our community. So we see this location as complementing that. The one option we think is cost-effective, the all-wood construction. The other we think is doable. It's just a little more expensive. And then trade-offs. One of the most significant things on Lift Tower that we would need to be thinking through as part of the RFP is the project phased in construction. We have 14 plus lovely tenants in the building right now, and housing is such a premium that ideally we would try to construct the project in 2 phases so that we would not have to move people twice type of deal. But that might turn out to not be possible. And so we're going into this project eyes wide open of whether people need to be moved to a different housing unit offsite while construction, or can we do 2 phases? And then obviously, because of the topography, there will be some significant earthwork at that piece. So that's kind of the background on some of the proposals, and we have some time for Q&A before we kind of break up into the boards.